Thank you very much, Jack. A little thing that you folks should know about me, I never make the same mistake twice. I make it about 5 or 6 times just to be really sure. And consequently, this is about the 5th or 6th debate at the very tall, the very witty, and the very smart Bill Watson, and I'm sure I'll come out looking the same as I did all other previous times, which is a little worse for the wear. So, having said that, I want to address the question straight up. Is there too much wealth in Canada, or rather, do the wealthy have too much power in Canada? Well, monarchs knew it, so did military generals and religious leaders. Wealth is power, but with what power comes responsibility. The more you have, the greater the responsibility. At least so goes the theory of moral sentiments till not very long ago. Over the course of the past generation, the wealthy have become a lot more wealthy and a lot more powerful in Canada as well as around the world. The problem is not so much that the wealthy are too powerful. The problem is that with very rare exception, as their powers have increased, it's not been matched by an increased sense of responsibility. On the contrary, the wealthy have been using their power for a couple of decades now to reduce their responsibilities to anybody but themselves. Here's the litany, en bref. Taxes are too high. Governments are too big. There are too many rules. Workers are way, way, way too entitled, and boy, is it ever hard to get good help these days. Any restriction on the freedom of the wealthy is characterized as an attack on everybody's freedom. Well, I'm not sure that that is quite so true, but no institution is perfect, and what rankles the powerful more than most, is that any checks on their power at all are viewed as unnecessary, particularly when the checks come from those who only have countervailing power because they are organized in their power through strength in numbers. Unions, for example. Unions which exist only at the pleasure of a majority of workers in a workplace. Unions are portrayed as pariahs on the productive process. Governments, for example, which are selected by the will of the engaged voting public. Governments are viewed as leeches on the wealth creators. For those with wealth and power, the problem with democracy is that there's too much of it. Well, that's not that terribly new. G.K. Chesterton said it best 100 years ago. That British novelist said, "The poor sometimes object to being governed badly. The rich object to being governed at all." What's new is the degree to which countervailing power and voice, far from being viewed as beneficial for preventing a system which is naturally tilted tip right over, are viewed as obstacles to be overcome. The wealthy and the power, they want to be left alone, to pursue their interests unchecked. They're on track for wrecking the game for everyone, though. Maybe you don't believe that they're on track for wrecking the game for everyone. Don't take my word for it. This wisdom comes to us via the International Monetary Fund. Their economists have documented that the greater the degree of inequality in society, the shorter the spells of economic growth. Now, market volatility defies rule number 1 in making money: do not lose it. But you should also not leave money on the table. And that's what happens when you shorten the spells of growth. You get less growth overall. More equity doesn't mean less efficiency. It means more opportunity, more raw potential for growth. And that can sell. Opportunity sells. What doesn't sell is the public service. Once esteemed, public service is today denigrated. The very words themselves speak of serving one's community, one's country for the greater good. The concept of service today, though, is eclipsed by a focus on growth. You have to ask yourself, in whose interest is it that governments are portrayed as a drag on the economy, that the only thing that they can do well is to goose growth? Certainly not in the interests of those who most rely on government services, who cannot buy the opportunities that might unlock their potential and the potential of the society and economy around them. Now, in the wake of the crisis, which, lest you forgot, socialized losses and privatized profits, in the wake of that crisis, we're struggling with slow growth, volatile markets, and the rise of what I like to call bully capitalism. The business pages are full of stories of revenues going down and profits going up. Well, what's up with that? The business pages are also full of workers getting less as people at the top get more. One way to keep up this perpetual conveyor belt of money moving up the ranks, of growing profits despite slow or no growth, is to erode workers' bargaining power and squeeze labor costs to yield higher dividends. In Canada, since the crisis, temporary jobs have grown at 3 times the pace of permanent ones, and you know that you can't demand much if you've got a temporary job. Temporary foreign workers have more than doubled in number since 2006 in this country. We never used to rely on guest workers as a way of building the nation. But that's still not good enough for some. In Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and parts of the federal government, well-heeled lobbyists come to visit to help advance proposals for right-to-work legislation. And some politicians are carrying the can on the idea. Let me be clear. The right to work means the right to work without union representation or protection. The right to work simply means the right to work for less. In contrast, Canada's top 1% enjoyed a whopping 32% of all the gains in income growth in the decade before the crisis. That's 4 times more than a similar period of economic expansion which took place in the 1960s. It's double the amount that the rich gained from growth in the roaring 20s. We are in uncharted territory. Meanwhile, the proportion of jobs paying between $30,000 and $60,000 a year just keeps shrinking. There are more people doing better, but over half of Canadian workers, you might be surprised to learn, make less than $30,000. Now, all of these figures are in inflation-adjusted terms. More than half of Canadians earn less than $30,000 a year. That's a bigger proportion of the job market than it was in the 1970s. So we've had a 30-year social experiment that the evidence shows failed. That experiment said, give more money to the rich, they'll invest it and create jobs and prosperity for everyone. They didn't say where. As one wag put it, trickle-down economics might have worked if it weren't for the sponges at the top. Now, okay, maybe that's not so funny. It's certainly not very smart. The fuel of capitalism, let me remind you, is mass production, which in turn depends on mass consumption. In Canada, we have 2.5 million businesses. About 20,000 of them, just a handful, rely on international markets. Canadian businesses mostly rely on Canadian purchasing power, not the middle class in an emerging market. And if I can't buy, you can't sell. The business pages are full of stories of falling corporate revenues, rising profits. Why? Because from banks to retailers, CEOs sympathetically declare, it's unfortunate, but the new normal for Canada's middle class is that businesses, any business, must outsource, must reduce costs. This is said with a straight face as they reap record pay packages for themselves and crank up their dividends for their shareholders. Corporations and their handmaidens, let us not be surprised by this. They're entitled to their entitlements. And what is that entitlement? To make more money at any cost, human or environmental. But woe to anyone else that tries to claim any such rights. James S. Henry is a former chief economist at McKinsey & Company. He's pointed out that no special interest group is quite as rich and powerful as the rich and powerful. Mr. Henry estimates, and I thank Financial Post columnist Terry Corcoran for bringing this to my attention, that wealthy individuals have squirreled away $32 trillion, that's with a T, $32 trillion in private financial wealth in offshore tax havens. It's been in the news in Canada too. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Grecian formula, and that catch-me-if-you-can mentality is contagious. It spreads like a virus, and it promotes the view that all taxes are bad and you're a putz if you pay. Of course, the same folks that decry taxes want to live in some civilized society with all the benefits that taxes provide, because taxes are the price of civilized society. Now, as F. Scott Fitzgerald said in 1925, the rich are not like you and me. They raise their kids where services are their best. They get their business done where labor costs are cheapest. They hide their money where no tax man shines. It's a system that works very tidily for the most affluent, but it unleashes this never-ending set of demands for low and lower wages, low and lower taxes, and less supports and protections from a government increasingly designed to support and protect those who need the least help. Some call it a race to the bottom, except the folks at the top keep cracking new ceilings and pulling up the ladder of opportunity behind them. One hopes, of course, that the less advantaged will stop being so selfish and being so noisy, so that the rich can continue to be entitled to their entitlements, which includes endlessly more. Of course, it's tough to convince folks that big is never big enough. So the necessary counterpart to pursuing an ever bigger share of the market is pursuing an ever bigger share of the marketplace of ideas. The wealthy get more face time with politicians than the average voter, and they get also to hire lobbyists that influence which legislation moves through, at what pace, which rules get enforced or overlooked, who wins and who loses government funding. The wealthy finance the best ideas that money can buy too. Witness the bonanza in donations for business-friendly programs of research in universities, and the numbers and budgets of pro-business think tanks is on the rise too. There's nothing like buying the medium also. If you want to control the message, buy the medium. And apparently the wealthy don't think their voice is getting heard enough. So we have Exhibit A, Sun TV in Canada, and Exhibit B, plans by the Koch brothers in the United States to buy out the Chicago Tribune and about 7 other regional newspapers. Forbes magazine is happy to tell you that there are 1,426 billionaires today who control your world. They breathlessly add progress is being made because more women are part of that list. 138 of them instead of 104 of them last year. These women and men become billionaires by selling us soap and clothes and cars. They build roads and provide energy that everyday people need to use, but also everyday people help produce, transport, stock, and sell. As Warren Buffett famously said, if this is a class war, my side is winning. It is not helpful when our governments exacerbate rather than offset the increasingly preferential treatment of the rich in the marketplace. To be told in Canada that we will all benefit from a tax-free savings account and from income splitting for young families is at best stretching the truth. The government's own analysis shows that the cost to the public purse of these initiatives runs into the multiple billions of dollars, scarce resources that could make life easier for hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And most of that big bag of money flows to those at the top of the income spectrum. Not a penny goes to the working poor whose incomes are too low to save, or to single parents, the group with the highest rate of poverty in the country, who have no incomes to split. And our government, known for its zero tolerance of dissent, is not neutral in what ideas will be heard either. Right from their first year in office, they have silenced advocacy organizations they don't agree with, muzzled scientists, statisticians, and even politicians who carry information that is off message, refused to provide information for critical public policy oversight, and even have made information disappear as the sorry result of the senseless census cuts were revealed in the last 24 hours. So, this week, we can learn, thanks to Wealth Insight, a private sector research firm, where the world's millionaires and billionaires live, how much they make, and what their ages are, including those in Canada. But we learned that we will know nothing about the folks living in 43% of Saskatchewan's communities because of low response rates to because of the federal government's decision to turn a mandatory census, which every civilized country uses for public policy purposes, into a voluntary exercise. Accept this as the new normal, and we will know only what the plutocrats want us to know. Accept the message that the highest human endeavor is the pursuit of ever greater wealth, rather than the pursuit of the greater good, and watch the disasters roll in. From child labor to workplaces that are death traps, from rigging interest rates to rigging the game, history has shown that the very wealthy have great difficulty placing limits on their own desires. The quest for wealth doesn't have to have the quest for wealth doesn't have a built-in stabilizer that keeps things in balance. That's what government is for. And what's the best message coming out of all of this? The idea that the most important thing that you can do with your life is to make money at any cost. Government, too, has become compromised. We are left asking fundamental questions that hang in the air. What is economic growth for if it doesn't deliver broad-based prosperity? What are governments for if they don't serve and protect the public interest? So in answer to your question, do the wealthy have too much power? Well, as we girls like to say, it's not so much what you got, it's how you use it. The real question is not whether the wealthy have too much power, but rather how they use their power. And history has shown countless times that the youth of wealth and power in the pursuit of ever greater wealth, with little thought for the greater public good, wrecks the game for everyone. Thank you.
Now, Bill Watson for 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for coming out. I know you'd rather be home watching the first game of the Montreal Canadiens' historic playoff comeback. But I hope you have your PVRs working. It's always wonderful to debate Armine. I hope you noticed the very sneaky way in which she tried to build up her opponent, just the way Paul McLean and Michel Therrien did before the series, talking about how wonderful their players were and what gentlemen the other team consisted of. And so I hope you disregard all that. I've debated Armine a number of times. It's a wonderful experience. She has lots of energy and comes at you full force. It's kind of like the charge of the left brigade. Onward, onward, into the valley of debt. In any case, this is the MacDonald Laurier Institute, so I want to start with a quiz. What is John A. MacDonald's second most famous quote? Now, it's a rhetorical quiz, so I won't actually ask for an answer. What is John A. MacDonald's second most famous quote? Well, I think the most famous quote, there's an historian here, there are MacDonald experts in the audience, I expect, but I'd wager that his most famous quote is, "As for myself, my course is clear. A British subject I was born, a British subject I will die." And of course, that was part of the 1891 campaign, and 2 or 3 months afterwards, he did die. What was the second most famous quote? I'd say the second most famous quote is, "I must have another $10,000. Will be the last time of calling. Do not fail me. Answer today." That, of course, was from his alleged telegram to Hugh Allen, head of the Canadian Pacific Railway Consortium, 6 days before the 1872 election, which MacDonald won. And there's some debate among historians about whether it was a Liberal hoax or not, but there's very little debate about the fact that the 1872 election was a wash in cash, and of course $10,000 in those days was real money. So rich people, wealthy people were very close to Canadian politicians at that time. I took Canadian history when Marxism was cresting in the universities. There was even a theory that Confederation was mainly a device for the benefit of British bondholders. Right? The idea was that 4 little colonies, each of which was threatened by a large neighbor, would not be very good at repaying interest or principal on money lent to it, whereas if you could amalgamate the colonies, then that would be a better bet for bondholders. Now that's power when you bring about Confederation because of your concern about a little part of your portfolio that may be at risk. If wealth had that kind of power to bring about the CPR and to bring about Confederation? Well, bully for wealth. You talk about bully capitalism. I'd say bully for wealth. Those were two good things, and if it took importuning by wealthy people to do it, then that was a good thing. This is the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, so I should be bipartisan in my slurs against politicians. In 1930, Mackenzie King lost the general election of July of that year. He's conceded to his diary and to his late mother and to his dog that it was probably the luckiest thing that happened to him politically to lose the 1930 election, because he got to sit out the Great Depression. But in the first days as opposition leader, he discovered apparently that that office didn't come with a car. There was no car for the opposition leader in those days. The opposition leader had to walk or provide his own car. Sam McLaughlin, head of General Motors of Canada, gave him a Cadillac, just sent him a Cadillac to the leader of the opposition. I don't know what Cadillacs cost in those days, but you know, Cadillac was a Cadillac. Now, Mackenzie King could have afforded his own Cadillac, because in the 1920s, a consortium of business people, a little group headed by the president of the Salada Tea Company, got together and created a fund for him of $225,000, 1920s dollars. That's equivalent to $2.9 million today. It wasn't known, but it made it easier for King to pursue politics. They were very wealthy people and had influence. I might add that if wealth were so powerful, why have we had 1,300% inflation since the 1920s? $225,000 up to $2.9 million. You can confirm that on the Bank of Canada handy inflation calculator. I get the tidbit about the Cadillac from In Search of R.B. Bennett, which is this wonderful biography of Bennett that was published last year by P.B. Waite, a very distinguished Canadian historian, who, when he published it, was 90, we haven't had age inflation yet, years old. And it's a terrific book. I'm told on good authority that the book that Waite sent to the current Prime Minister as a gift was inscribed, "I knew R.B. Bennett. R.B. Bennett was a friend of mine. You're no R.B. Bennett." Anyway, I'd argue that things are quite different now. Political donations are strictly limited, very small ceiling, not indexed, by the way. The spending of political parties, it's a lot of money for us, but by the standards certainly of U.S. campaigns, the amount of money that political parties are allowed to spend is very strictly controlled. There's an Elections Canada website with a search engine. You can search by name to find out who has provided money to political parties. In the last 5 years, there's nothing from anybody named Yalnizyan. There is a person named David Granitstein who's been giving very regularly to the NDP. Your brother. The long-lost brother. And I'm sort of astounded to say that there is a William Watson who gave $390.82 to the Liberals on my birthday last year. But it wasn't me. So we control this sort of thing, and we make it transparent in a very extreme way now. There's no cash sent to John A. Macdonald in $10,000 bundles. Finance, if you look at the site, is in very small amounts. 390.82 is actually a large number. A lot of campaign finance is basically crowd financed or crowdsourced. Obama, the Democrat, outspent the Republican in the last election and did so mainly with relatively small donations. He has rich Hollywood friends, but the bulk of the money came in from relatively small donations. The Tories are good at this, and the Liberals are catching up. Lobbying is similarly transparent. There's a lobbyist registration website. There's no Yalnizyan. I didn't check on Granitstein. There's no William Watson, a lobbyist. But you can use the search engine to find out who's been talking to various public officials. If you put in Harper Stephen. The Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association comes out tops in the number of contacts, but the CAW is in there. It's number 16, but it's in there. And Ken Loenza is a frequent lobbyist. There are 20 members of the CAW who are registered as lobbyists. Many of you know Jim Stanford from the panel Tuesday nights about economics on the National. Jim, a friend of ours, is a registered lobbyist. If you search under Flaherty James, I'm pleased to learn that McGill University is the 12th most frequent lobbyist. My employer is being industrious and exercising due diligence. The AFL-CIO is the 7th most common lobbyist. So if you're concerned about lobbying, you can just go on that search engine and find out who's been talking to whom. There are little reports about the subject of the meeting and when it took place and so on. It is true, as Armine said, that wealthy people get more contact with politicians than the rest of us do. My main contact with the rich and powerful in Canada occurs at the finance minister's annual summer retreat. In these retreats, they last a day and a half. Brian Crowley has organized the last 3 or 4, 25 or so people from various walks of life, many in business, some in the universities, some unionists, not many, are invited to come and sit around the table and talk about the policy problems that Canada faces. And Flaherty sits there and listens. A couple of times when I've been making my little remarks to that group, I've noticed that he's actually written things down when I was speaking. I've learned at subsequent budgets that what he was writing down was, don't even think of doing this, because it never shows up in the budget. The people around the table are, I assume, upper income, particularly the corporate types. You only need $200,000 a year to get into the top 1% in Canada, so it's not the highest bar. It's certainly not a bar that's as high as it is in the United States, where it's something like $450,000. But I think it's not their wealth that gets them there. It's the fact that they head up important economic institutions. And politicians are interested in growth. They're interested in economic activity. They do better when we have growth and economic activity and employment. And they really want to find out how to get that. So I don't think it's the wealth of such people that gets them to the table. It's their position. If we had rules that you could not make over $100,000, we had a rule during World War II, I hope Jack will agree with me, that you can't make over $7,000 without a ministerial permit and so on. If we had a rule that limited them to $75,000, they'd still be at the table because they're the head of important institutions, and the finance minister wants to know the reaction of people who do head important institutions. We were asked during those meetings to take off our institutional hats and talk about what's good for Canada. In my experience, everybody does that except university presidents who say, I'm taking off my institutional hat, but you know, education is really important, and university education is most important of all. But what I don't see is what you would expect. There's no Tea Party. I believe this is true. I haven't heard anybody except me say the taxes should be lower. You just don't hear this refrain that taxes should be lower. People are asked to work outside their area of expertise. Generally from that group, I find you get what you get from talking to average Canadians. For every problem that we have, there should be a program. Right? For every problem that we have, there should be a program. I think that's how everybody in Canada thinks now. Some of these folks say, for every problem in Canada, there should be a government program that works better, so they have some complaints about existing programs. But they're very instrumentalists. I mean, I think this is only natural. If you're a CEO, your life is a to-do list, right? You've got problems that you face, and you've got to solve problems, and what you do all day long is solve problems. And so if you observe a social problem, Well, let's get to work on it. Let's put together a task force. Let's devote some resources to it. Let's work on it. So the only libertarians at the table tend to be the academic economists, the only people who really want this hands-off government. Everybody wants a government that works better, and everybody worries when taxes get over 50% of GDP, but there isn't really a Tea Party. They favor programs for training, they want programs for innovation. They're wealthy, but they're not at all libertarian. Now, the influence of the wealthy, let's judge by results, right? What have we got? We got a big government. If you look at the OECD numbers, we're in there in the middle. We have a big government. There's a lot of our economy that goes towards government. We have a big welfare state. Taxes are 43% of family spending, which is more now than spending on food, clothing, and shelter. Marginal rates are not at the 80 or 90% that they were in the 1950s, in which I honestly don't believe anybody paid. But they're still close to 50%, and they haven't come down once the surtaxes were removed. They haven't come down appreciably. I think we're all concerned about poverty. I'm not concerned about inequality. I don't care what happens at the top. I do care, unlike Armine, about what happens at the bottom. I'm much more concerned about what happens at the bottom. Inequality is rising, but in fact, poverty is declining. It has been declining since about 1990. It's even, if you look at the percentage of people under the LICO, the low-income cutoff, it even went down in 2009 and 2010. They must have the numbers, they must be counting the numbers wrong or something, but the poverty rate, StatsCan doesn't want to use that as a poverty rate, but everybody does. Those numbers went down in 2009 and 2010, which is sort of astounding. Now, Kevin Milligan, a very good and not at all right-wing economist at the University of British Columbia, says, this has basically happened as a result of policy changes. Rates of poverty among seniors, almost nil as a result of policy. Single-parent families headed by women, used to be 42% of such families were under the LICO. Now it's about 21% of such families. Poverty in that group has been cut in half from 2000. It was 42% in 2000. It's down to 21% now. All this is happening in the dark Middle Ages of conservative, post-Reagan, post-Thatcher government. The impact of government, according to the OECD, is becoming more redistributive. Government in Canada is becoming, and generally throughout the world, is becoming more redistributive. It is true that inequality is growing faster than this ability to redistribute or propensity to redistribute, but the propensity to redistribute is also growing. So, down at the bottom, things are not great, but they're not getting dramatically worse. Why is this? Well, we have universal suffrage now. We didn't in 1867. Politicians are somewhat self-interested. They at least seek employment. They want to be in government. The votes are in the middle class. Right? If you're too close to the wealthy, you're going to be in trouble. Ask President Romney. Justin Trudeau says, in fact, he got into politics to help the middle class, even though he's not one of them. Tom Mulcair, he's talking much less about helping working Canadians, and he's also concerned with the middle class. Now, Armine's own research has shown that basically everybody, even people up at the top, work. We're all working Canadians. Some are just a little more successful at it, I guess, than others. Stephen Harper is also going after the middle class. Toronto elites will tell you all the time there's nobody in the country more middle class and bourgeois than Stephen Harper. And that's where his bread is buttered. I think that's his culture, that's his background, that's who he is, but also that's where the votes are. So he plays footsie with the wealthy at his electoral peril. Finally, I think the question should be asked, what power? This idea that there are people at the top that get together and manipulate levers of power, it's very quaint. It's so 20th century, right? Moises Naim, who for 14 years was editor of Foreign Policy, has just written a book, only slightly longer than its title, called The End of Power: From Boardrooms to Battlefields and Churches to States, Why Being in Charge Isn't What It Used to Be. And his theory is, you've got rising middle classes around the world. You've got the internet and social media, which is empowering at least commentary. You've got mobility. If people don't like a regime, they can increasingly move. And his view is, being powerful just isn't what it used to be. It's not nearly as much fun because there's micro power everywhere. The President of the United States is still powerful, but his behavior is more constrained than it was. Lawyers maybe are powerful. According to Naeem, we're awash in checks and balances. And I need 30 seconds because the whole talk won't work without it. We're awash in checks and balances. Procedure is taking over Canadian society. Let's go back to MacDonald. John A. eventually got his railway. There were problems with finance. There were serious problems with technology because it was a big, long railway over a country that hadn't really been explored terribly much. Modern Canadian elites badly want a pipeline to the Pacific. That's an easier problem. The money is there. The technology is not a problem. Are they going to get that pipeline? I guess I would bet against them. Right? We did get the railway. It's not clear to me that we're going to get the pipeline. And the reason is that the wealthy just don't have the power that they had in John A.'s day. Thank you very much.
Now, rebuttals, 5 minutes each. Armine first.
I must confess, Bill, that I started wondering, whether I was going to agree with you about anything that you would have to say, and I found myself completely transfixed by almost everything you said. So I congratulate you. Yeah, I congratulate you in identifying that there's no problem with rising power, and that the rich are. It's quaint to think that the rich have any kind of stranglehold on any decision making. It's true that rising public power is happening. I mean, I think that is. Maybe our saving grace, that people are waking up to the fact that there's more of us than there are of the plutocracy. And if you could only organize yourself the way businesses organize themselves and get jiggy with a message. I mean, that was the problem with Occupy. Okay, so you've identified the problem. What do you want? Well, we've identified the problem. So this was not a way of moving forward. And in fact, I think that's the really striking thing to me is that this failed experiment of give the rich more money and they will make things better for everybody, that the evidence keeps showing over and over again, there's no ready counterpart to that. There's no, there doesn't seem to be a political thrust to that zombie economics. But it seems to me that where you and I would disagree, I think, fairly fundamentally, is the sniff test. Or maybe you would agree with me, I don't know, the sniff test about whether or not the wealthy actually do hold the reins of power. And the sniff test I'm going to talk about is who benefits from how problems are defined. So let's think about the problems that have been defined. In the middle of the worst crisis since the 1930s, in January of 2009, the federal government introduced the tax-free savings account. At a time when the entire world was gripped with the problem of inadequate spending and purchasing power, we had a federal government saying, take more money out of the system, park it, and we will give you tax shelter on how your money grows. I want to point out that this was a failed experiment in the United States. Bush tried to bring it in 3 times in the United States, modified it. Harper got it through the first time round. Why was it rejected in the United States? Because everybody there said the rich would benefit too much from it. And the Library of Parliament showed the exact same thing when we did the test on how it would work. When we did the post-mortem, not on the test of how it would work, because you never know what the uptake's going to look like, but in February of 2013, the Finance Department, in their tax expenditures report, put out an appendix showing, okay, so who's benefiting from the tax-free savings account? And it's everybody you'd expect, people that can't put money into their their registered retirement savings plan because they're over 65 and they've used up all, or they've used up all their tax room. Yeah, there's people that are younger and people that are poorer, but the people that are using it the most are loaded and they're older. So, I mean, it's just there. So in the middle of a 4.5-year choke fest in the economy, we've got 1.3 million people still unemployed. We have got 400,000 young people, which is roughly the same number of young people that were unemployed in the middle of the worst crisis. They're still sidelined. And we are defining the problem du jour in the labor market as a skills shortage. And what's the solution? Temporary foreign workers. And why can't we find anybody locally to do this stuff? Because they don't speak Mandarin if they're coal miners and unemployed in BC, and they won't accept working for the minimum wage if they're in Whitehorse because they can't actually get an apartment working full-time, full year at the minimum wage in Whitehorse. So what's the solution? Bring more people in that actually, this looks like heaven to them. They will live 5, 6, 7 people at a time, and that's fine by them. The part that drives me nuts, and it should drive you nuts too, Bill, I hope, is that they're good enough to do the work, but they're not good enough to stay. And when you get that kind of revolving door where you can come in and you can work and go ahead, bust your butt, we love you, remit the money back home, that's okay. But if you can't stay and demand more, you're here at the pleasure of the employer and you stay as long as the employer wants you here, there's trouble in this kind of class-free paradise. I've got other issues, but you know, I'm gonna let him go on because my 5 minutes is over.
It is. Bill, 5 minutes.
We'll deal with Armine's issues later. And, you know, the TFSA, the idea is you don't tax the return to savings. I think a lot of economists agree with that. Bringing it in 2009, you got to bring it in sometime. But in that budget, you were bringing in $60 billion worth of stimulus, right? Don't forget about the $60 billion worth of stimulus. And 2% of, or maybe it was less than that, 2% of GDP. It was a big stimulus, right? So the TFSA is a long-term program. I don't think it's going to subtract from the stimulus anything like $50 billion. Skill shortage, I don't think, I mean, the temporary workers program, as I understood it, was you got somebody, you have a requirement for somebody with some completely arcane, super duper computer skill. You can't find them in Canada. You've searched for 5 years. There is somebody in Germany with that. You can bring them over. You can have them work for you a little bit. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. It's also an agricultural workers program because it does seem that Canadians don't want to do stoop labor anymore. You know, I think basically we agree on that program. It should not be a program to essentially replace people, certainly on a permanent basis anywhere in the economy. I hope you'll agree we should have large-scale immigration. We do have large-scale immigration and we're well served by it, and it's probably best to get rid of these kind of niche programs. And you notice how quickly the government caved on that, right? If wealthy people were as influential as we tend to think, then they shouldn't have caved so quickly. You know, corporations are more craven than I think almost any organization in society. They're deathly afraid of a brand crisis, right? You know, Loblaws, I'm sure, had some probably small moral responsibility for what happened in Bangladesh, but they sure are getting out in front of this story because they're deathly afraid that that brand's going to be completely dead. Now, there may also be good people at Loblaws as well, so that they understand that they do have moral responsibility. But it's not a case of people sitting back with top hats and cigars and saying, we're going to do things our way, right? And the people are opposed to that, but, they're the people and we run things. There is a great alertness on the part of corporations to their brand because they know they can get hurt. This is one of the things that Naeem talks about in terms of micro power, that consumers are empowered. There are many more consumers than there used to be. There are hundreds of millions of consumers now in China that are going to want to exercise such preferences, and a couple of 100 million in India, and more every day. So if you're getting to a world middle class of 1 or even 2 billion people, that's a lot of diffuse power, and people are going to have to jump to that. Within the business sector, there are a number of studies that look at how long companies can stay in the top 20 on the Fortune 500, or the top 5 in their industry. And the volatility in industries is growing. It may be that in the 60s and 70s, when John Kenneth Galbraith was writing about the new industrial state, things were effectively stable. But in this day and age, technology is changing things rapidly, and you've got to be forever alert. Your power, if you have it, is evanescent. And you can find that you're number 1 in 1990, and by 1998, you're not even in the game. We have had, I concede, a small problem since 2008. But in terms of delivering prosperity, in 2007, the unemployment rate in Canada had worked itself to a 30-year low. Right? I learned my economics, I learned my sort of contemporary macroeconomic history in the 70s and 80s. Two things I never thought would happen. I never thought we'd have free trade with the United States. We did. Eventually. But I also never thought that the unemployment rate would get back down below 6%, where it had been in the 1960s. So, the wealth had been spread. Now, that was 2007, and we're now 2013, and the recession has been going on for longer than anybody would want. But what we got now is an unemployment rate of the sort that we were used to in the 70s when Armine's types of policies were in vogue. So.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's your turn. I'd ask you to come to the... You want your turn or you don't want your turn? To come to the mics and pose a question. Be brief, please, and direct it to either one or both of the debaters. Nobody has any questions.
It's a Canadian audience.
It's a Canadian audience, yes.
Hi. Good evening. This is my first time coming to one of these events, and so I find it quite educational. Although there are a couple of things that I'm probably not 100% up to speed on. So, Mr. Watson, I would agree with you in that instead of discussing the top 1%, I'd like to focus on those most vulnerable in our country, and that is our children. You yourself came somewhat ill-prepared, and maybe you could correct by giving us exact stats again on how many children in this country are below the poverty line?
Yeah, happy to.
Oh, and then the next part of my question is, with the census and the extended portion of that being no longer mandatory, how are we ever going to get proper statistics again that will let us know if we are improving or not improving the single parents and children and the people who are most vulnerable? Thanks.
Okay. When Parliament made that declaration in 1989 that the country should dedicate itself to getting rid of child poverty, there were more than 1 million kids in poverty. The last numbers I saw, it might be 2008 instead of 2009, was 600,000. 600,000. Now, there are fewer kids. There are fewer kids now than there were then, but the rate among children is lower. We have many more kids going out and earning a lot of money. It's their parents that create people always say we got too much child poverty, we got to do something about it, and that sort of suggests send the kids to the mines, and we won't have to worry about that. So the numbers are down. They're not zero, but the numbers are down. And the rate of poverty among children is down as of 2008 or 2009. Give me your email. I'll send you the numbers. I'm happy to do that. Yeah. Well, the unemployment rate was higher in 2009 than it is now, and that kind of thing is usually correlated with the unemployment rate. So I'd still bet that, we don't get those numbers on a real-time basis, so we won't have today's numbers for another year and a half or 2 years. But I'm not an expert on that. There may be people here who are an expert on that. I'm pretty sure we will, because I think a lot of that is labor force survey, but Armine may know about that.
As well. So the numbers that Bill is using, we have many ways of measuring poverty. And the way that Bill is referring to is the LICO. This is what he said. That was the gold standard in Canada for many years. It's based in 1992. Anything that's based in 1992 drops over time. It hasn't been rebased for years because Statistics Canada wanted to move to a different measure. The measure they have moved to, the measure that is the gold standard now internationally, is called the low-income measure, and taken after tax, child poverty is today higher than it was in 1989 when we declared across all party lines we would eliminate it, both in terms of rates and number of kids, and it's higher today than it was in the 1970s. The real problem we have going forward is not so much the rate of poverty, but the fact that more and more young people are having a really tough time getting into the labor market, forming families, doing all the things that they're supposed to be doing, and being able to earn enough money with steady enough work to be able to support families. Everybody in that age group under 35 is scrambling. We have 3 times the number of temporary jobs than we did, the number of temporary jobs is growing at 3 times the rate of permanent jobs. This is a temporary recovery, and we haven't even begun to look at what happens if we hit another recession.
I don't think you can say it's a temporary recovery until we've passed another 4 or 5 years. Phil Cross of the MLI looked at youth unemployment in the last 3 recessions and compared it to the current recession and found out it was worse in the last 3 recessions than it is now. This is a long recession. In terms of depth, it's relatively mild. Yeah, sorry. Okay.
Can I go to this questioner?
Thanks. Marnie McCall. I usually ask questions here. I'm a historian by training, a social policy analyst, and also a lawyer, so I cover a lot of territory. Just with regard to the last one, the goal was to eliminate child poverty entirely by 2000. We have failed miserably at that. And which leads to my other question, which is if we have enforced and recovered all of the tax owing in this country, we would not have had the deficit that we currently have in the first place, and we would have been able to devote money to those kind of problems. So my question is, we have the laws, we have tax evasion, tax avoidance, we have an enforcement arm at CRA, but they don't seem to be very good at collecting anything. And is this because they don't in fact get funded to do it? And who decides that? And who's, it is to the benefit of the people who have the wealth to park it offshore and not pay their taxes. And, I don't have enough money to park offshore. And quite frankly, I was raised in a way that would never occur to me to do that in the first place. So, a lot of our difficulties, our deficits and our inability to carry out the programs we commit to, like eliminating child poverty by the year 2000, we have visited on ourselves because we've not put the emphasis in the right place on collecting the money that belongs in the system. And I'm not really sure if the question is how do we collect the money, or why haven't we been collecting the money? Either one of those. Thank you.
Okay. Armine, you want to go first?
Yes. In fact, today I think it was that or maybe it was yesterday, the federal government announced that they are hiring more people for the tax evasion unit. But just as there are people that work in the temporary foreign worker program doing labor market opinions and assessing whether workers are getting paid, apparently assessing that the prevailing wage is actually being paid, there's all sorts of rules on the books that are not enforced. And so it's not clear to me that even if they hire more people, that they would be instructed to pursue the prosecution of tax fraud or collecting money. But the bigger thing I want to say to you is that the signal that has been sent by this government is that they will not work in concert with other governments to make sure that there is more capture of this money through tax havens. They've made it perfectly clear. It's a government that does not play well with others, generally speaking, but they have made it perfectly clear that cranking down on anything tax-related is off the books, and that's kind of what you need in an era where capital is increasingly global. You need international, at least, approaches to preventing the erosion of the tax base on many developed nations.
I think it's a crime against humanity every time a brilliant young person becomes a tax lawyer. But, of course, what does cause them to do that is it's so lucrative. I think Armine would agree with me that what we need to do is try to simplify the tax code as much as possible. She probably won't agree with me that what we need are lower marginal rates. What creates an incentive to hide money? Not necessarily illegally, but taking advantage of one of those many, many sub-articles in the thousands of pages of the tax code. It's the high marginal rate, right? So if we could lower the marginal rates, it may well be that we could bring in more money. In the news lately, there has been a lot of talk about X billion dollars that's not collected. I mean, it sounds like it's just lying on the sidewalk, and of course we have a theorem in economics that you never find a $20 bill on the sidewalk because if it were on the sidewalk, somebody would have picked it up already. So, I don't know if I believe those numbers. It seems to me a very hard thing to do to try to estimate how much money is hidden. By its nature, they're trying to hide it. So, it seems to me most of the governments I deal with are very keen to get extra revenue. So I think the current government doesn't like international trendiness, and it likes Canadian sovereignty. And I think it's possible to oppose some of the more outlandish, aggressive tax treaties that are proposed on those two grounds without it just being, Stephen Harper is anal. But
Armine, at the beginning of your of the debate, you talked about the fact that the public is not part of policy making. Is it because of the fact that the wealthy are occupying the top-level jobs and therefore preventing that kind of dialogue with the common man and informing them of what's actually happening in government so that they can be part of that discussion, or that they're making it so difficult that people just can't possibly understand their rhetoric?
If I understand your question, well, there's a bit of a tautology at the very beginning, like a kind of self-referential loop here. The wealthy are wealthy because they occupy the top jobs. And, everything in life is networks. It's who you know. So what we're seeing in the same data that shows us what's happening in the top 1% is the top 1%, even when they fall from grace from the top 1%, they stay, more and more of them are staying in the top 5%. So they don't fall very far. So I don't think it's necessarily nefarious, but frankly, when Bill says things like the top 1%, well, that's only 200,000, give or take, in Canada, well, 99% of Canadians are never going to get anywhere near that, like never. And the people making $200,000 don't care what happens to government because they don't need government. It's that line I used with Chesterton's, which is, the poor have often objected to being governed badly. The rich don't want to be governed at all. And that's because they don't need government. Poor people need government. The middle class needs government. So if you're living in this kind of world where you don't really rub shoulders, and what we know with income inequality is the longer it accelerates, the more, you're talking about it in the job market, but the more you've got this spatial polarization in the cities where we live. So our kids are being raised in areas where we're just repeating the pattern over and over again, where literally their opportunities are hardwired into their environment, be it the school or the type of recreational facilities they have or the people that they rub shoulders with. The rich and the poor really don't have that many places where they hang out together anymore. And it's maybe that is much more important and self-reinforcing in who gets the top jobs, who gets to call the shots, what's their worldview when they get there. So, we make a big fuss of getting more women at the top. Who cares if they were brought up in the same circumstances? I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Is that the public is not consulted on the policies.
We are consulted on the policies, but we're not paid attention to. There's tons of consultation out there, and then a lot of people just say, screw it, I give up, government's not there for me, which is exactly what they want, because they understand how powerful...
That's my point.
The wealthy understand how powerful government is. That's why they're constantly being lobbied by the wealthy. You look through your lobby lists, you're not going to find Joe Blow and Jill Smith there. They're all powerful people, because the non-powerful don't get time to visit, and they don't believe they can influence anything anyway.
Bill, you want to respond?
Well, it was a question for Armine, but I'll just repeat that, the net effect of government is getting more redistributive. The wealthy are in charge. They must have a sense of richesse oblige or something like that, because it's getting more redistributive. Working income tax benefit, child tax benefit, help down at the bottom end. And that's what gives you the improvement at the bottom end in terms of after-tax income.
Yes, thanks. I'd like to ask both the speakers a question, actually, and that is the definition of non-monetary wealth. I found it astonishing that one of the speakers would refer to Sun TV, which is precisely the sort of insurgent organization that the speaker would like, asking the difficult questions that we need to have asked, as opposed to the CBC, which must be at the pinnacle of this, certainly 5% of the wealthy and the overpaid and the bloated, which the government could easily get rid of. Now that is surely part of the, maybe not 1%, but 5% that we should be aiming at in this. And they have, the CBC have far too much power, but how does one quantify wealth in there? And because there are limitations, don't get me started in the Supreme Court, where a judge can sort of say, hey, I can look at a poorly written charter and pull stuff out the air and overrule a referendum in Parliament. Pretty cool.
So, since you were looking straight at me for mentioning Sun TV, I would simply say to you there are lots of...
I should apologize to you, because I came in a bit early and I didn't get your surname properly, and I don't think I should presume to call you Armine, so I had to think of something.
Feel free. My last name is Yalnizyan, but feel free to call me Armine. Feel free. And Sun TV, the more diversity of voice there is out there, the better for all of us, actually, is my profound feeling. So Sun TV raises important questions that we should be discussing. But it was CBC TV that lifted the hood on this temporary foreign worker thing, on the RBC outsourcing of work. This is what public institutions should be doing, asking the tough questions that nobody's got the balls to look at. If you're being funded by the same companies that want to perpetuate this cheap labor, low taxes routine. So we do need both sets of institutions. I'm not sure what you mean by the CBC being at the top 5%. Maybe some of the workers there are in the top 5%. The top 5% would be somewhere around the $100,000 mark. So I don't know what you want people to make, where they are, and maybe we could have a discussion about what would be an appropriate distribution of income. But just be aware that 51% of Canadians make less than $30,000. Who's speaking for them?
Bill Watson is.
I'd like to cede my time to the speaker, to the questioner here, is that he was doing well. I don't have anything to add on that. It was a question for her.
Question there.
Sure. So one aspect of wealth concentration that I haven't heard discussed yet is mobility between socioeconomic classes. And I'm talking about upwards mobility, not downwards mobility, because anyone with $1 million can choose some bad stocks, and that can happen fairly quickly. So I've seen studies in the United States where they divide into 5 socioeconomic classes that show how difficult it is to move upwards. And Bill, I think actually there's one reference, there was a comment you made, which you had said, those people at top, I guess they're just successful. And I think that's actually very important to this issue, because you were half joking, half for real. I can't completely tell if you're sarcastic or not. So there may be some truth to that, but I think it's actually a very unfair comment, because it's not recognizing the privilege that the people born into top socioeconomic classes have in maintaining that status.
But as you probably know, this is a topical subject, because there's a curve in this literature called the Great Gatsby curve.
Right on.
That has to do with social mobility. Now, I think he was a cheat and a drug runner and so on, but he attained he got into the top class, at least for a short time. I think that's the key issue. You know, I think a lot of people would say, I don't mind if there's inequality at the top or at the bottom or whatever, as long as people have the ability to get out. And so I think that is the key issue. And I'm sure you're familiar with work that looks at that makes comparisons internationally between how a son's, typically son's, income is related to his father's income. And there's a fairly high correlation in the United States, right? Rick Santorum, of all people, harped on that in the primary campaign, saying, look, you know, we've got this oligarchy that is replicating itself. Canada has a pretty low, by international standards, number. Denmark is the lowest of all. I think there's an emerging literature on, you know, how do you encourage this mobility? Most people's gut or instinctive reaction is, well, you know, let's have a bigger government. But France has a big government and doesn't have a tremendous amount of social mobility by this standard, right? The UK has a big government and doesn't have a lot of social mobility by this standard. So I think it's a little bit of a mystery what encourages a society in which people can move up. And we all want that society. Now, I think unless it's going to be like Lake Wobegon, you do have to have some downward mobility as well. Not everybody can be in the top 1%. We can all aspire to it, but it's a little lifeboat. And, you know, when I say 200,000, that is a fact, which in fact I got from you.
No, it's true.
People tend to think the top 1% is, well, they're all billionaires. Well, they aren't. We probably all know somebody that earns $200,000 a year. There may, in fact, be some people in this room that earn $200,000 a year or in that 1%. You know, I think that everybody that talks about this goes immediately to education. And they also go to early childhood education. It's kind of a Jesuit thing, you know, give me the child for the first 7 years and I will give you the man. I don't think we want to run our school system that way, but clearly there are people who get excluded really early on. And I see that not so much as an inequality problem, but as a poverty problem and a lasting poverty problem. I think we need to address that. One way is to have really good public schools. There are many obstacles to having really good public schools.
The question was to both of you, and really my question was, what specific policies do you think need to be implemented to address that? Rather than, I mean, you can say it's a mystery, but I think that's kind of a cop-out.
So the work that Bill was referring to is by a Canadian economist that's internationally renowned, Miles Korak, who was the one that came up...
Trained at McGill.
Who came up with the Great Gatsby curve. That's what it was dubbed in the United States. And actually, there is no mystery, because the charts all show that there is a very tight correlation between the degree of inequality in a society and the degree of social mobility. The more inequality you've got, the less mobility you've got. And that is true in a snapshot of time, and it is also true over time. When we look at the degree of mobility of the people at the top 1, I just mentioned it just a moment ago, that the people in the top 1 stay in the top 1%, the top 5% longer than they used to in the 1980s. The stats are all there that just show what the rotation is. So that's where the idea of plutocracy comes from. That's why Joseph Stiglitz, the chief economist of the World Bank, refers to governments of the 1%, for the 1%, by the 1%. There is this kind of lockdown that is occurring. What's the solution to it? Well, first of all, start addressing inequality. I mentioned previously that growing income inequality is leading to growing spatial inequality because people that are poor can't live in nice neighborhoods. They go to low-rent neighborhoods. What makes a low-rent neighborhood? Crummy schools, bad transit, nothing to do, no green spaces, few recreational outlets. It is a self-reinforcing thing. So if you want the next generation, yes, education is part of it. Yes, opportunity is important, but when opportunity becomes hardwired in your life as a young person, you know, when you can start predicting poverty by postal code, you know you are in trouble. That's why, you know, George Carlin used to say the American dream, they say it's the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it, you know? And by the way, tomorrow, The Great Gatsby is coming out in movie theaters across North America. And the amazing thing about this is how we are, everything 1920s is coming up again. The rich believe they deserve to be the rich. They really believe it. My parents' generation, the rich believed there, but for the grace of God, go I. You could move up, you could move down, you could go sideways. If you were rich, God bless you. You got rich because other people helped you get there. So part of it is what public policies do we put in place, but part of it is the cultural zeitgeist that we're in. And you know, I think we're in a period where all of these questions that Occupy raised are being surfaced again. What's the use of economic growth if it's happening for somebody else, someplace else? Why should I be busting my butt, getting into debt, getting educated, playing by all the rules, and I can't get ahead? So I think some very serious questions are emerging in our society that is going to change the culture of how we look at pretty basic values about who should be at the top and how did they get there.
Thank you. Question.
Good evening. My name is Ivan. I'm a graduate student. My question is mainly to Mr. Watson. Earlier in the presentation, your counterpart gave us a lot of statistics, like half of Canadian workforce making 30,000 or below, and obviously those statistics are quite telling. But and I noticed that throughout the presentation you didn't really refute those statistics. However, when it comes to statistics, we all know their limitations, and we all know the saying, lies, damn lies, statistics, right? And we also know that whenever these kind of debates occur, and whenever the question about influence of rich and rich get richer and poor get poorer, when it comes to things like that, there are statistics from both sides. But I just wanted to ask, well, maybe, I mean, it also seems to me that the fact that, well, let's say Ontario, like many people say, like the average Ontarian is right of center. So if, I don't know, if that's what I mean, like, I mean, so many people hold, like, I don't know, capitalist views despite those statistics. And so I just wanted maybe to hear your commentary. I mean, how come, and maybe even to ask me as well, if, I mean, we have those statistics, how come, I mean, nothing much is being done about it? I mean, are those statistics true, or if they are, how come nothing is being done? And
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bill, go first.
I think we had real trouble in the 1990s. Starting about 1995, you get an improvement in lots and lots of statistics, including incomes within each income group. You get improvement at the bottom, you get more improvement at the top, but generally you get improvement. We get to 2008, there's obvious difficulties that arise there. But, and we're recovering from that, and most of those numbers are getting better now, but they're getting better too slowly. But in terms of what policy is doing, as I've indicated, it's becoming more redistributive. And Kevin Milligan at UBC has a very good paper, which you can get on his website, where he looks at, what has happened to his choice of poverty rate, not my choice of poverty rate, what has happened to poverty rates over the last 15 or 20 years. And he sees them going down, right? And what he does, he's a very smart guy, he simulates, he's got several models, very well respected, lots of people use them, and he simulates what if we eliminate some of the major policy changes of the last 15 years in terms of child tax benefit, working income tax benefit, things of that sort, flat, right? Poverty line's basically flat. So his conclusion is, he's a very careful guy, he doesn't make strong conclusions, but he says it's not implausible that the policies have been responsible for the reductions in those poverty indicators. And, you know, I don't, in some sense all statistics are difficult, but I think Armine and I agree with her statistics. I think she's choosing her statistics selectively. I suspect she'd be willing to say that I was doing the same thing. But I think, you know, my facts are correct and her facts are correct. They're just different facts, and they come from slightly different perspectives. But I'd recommend the Milligan paper to you because he's widely regarded as very honest. I was going to leave that unsaid, but, you know,
Yes, I will say one thing, which is that I agree that the WITB and the working income tax benefit, child tax benefit, but particularly the Canada Child Tax Benefit, is probably the biggest thing that has reduced poverty because it's a direct transfer to the poorest families and it kind of fades out. However, almost everything that has been put in place in the last few years has widened the gap. So public policy has piled on to what the market has delivered. When I mentioned the tax-free savings account, it's a crazy redistribution of resources that we keep being told we don't have enough money to do anything. So let's give the money back in a big $2.5 billion bag and give most of it to the rich. Why would we do that? Why would we have a public policy pile-on that exacerbates what the market is already delivering? To me, going forward, what we are doing is actually entrenching what the market is delivering rather than offsetting it, which is the role of government.
Last question.
Hi, my name's Stephanie. I'm a single parent of 7-year-old twins, so I get where you're coming from on the left, but I'm also a credit and a half shy of my MBA, so I get where you're coming from as well. My brother is a vice principal. My brother is a vice principal at a low-income school, middle school in Nova Scotia, and my sister is a tax lawyer with an oil and gas company in Calgary. I get it. What I see when I'm talking to people that I'm around, and you have an idea of the circles, I don't feel that the law and the policies and the directives are fair towards the rich and the poor. So, I mean, I just want to hear your views on this, but when I look at the guy that runs, I won't name him, RBC, and he has done what I think is an awful thing to many Canadian families, taking their livelihood away, replacing them with temporary foreign workers, just putting families in a really difficult state. And then I look at somebody who gets thrown in jail for having possession of marijuana. Which is the worst crime? What's more, why aren't there more severe consequences when you cause this much damage economically? To me, this is something that I think corporations and business really have a good grasp on because they're loaded with lawyers. And they have so much protection that the average person doesn't have. And you will never have. I mean, you don't even bother taking your employer to work if your employer is bigger than middle-sized because it's going to cost you 30, 40 grand. And you don't have it. That's your year's salary. So you just got to suck it up. Whereas a big organization, that's nothing for them. And it's worth taking you to court to beat you down, to set the precedent that other employees won't do it. So I'm interested to hear, because when I think about power and wealth, I agree. If you're wealthy and you worked for it, you go for it. But also on the other hand, you have a responsibility and you have to follow the rules. And to me right now, the rules are not equal between the poor and the rich. And the consequences of the damage you do when you use them are not even. So
I really applaud you for what you bring to the table, but also what you've raised. I don't know how to say anything to you that is different. We know that systematically, the Law Commission of Ontario on April the 3rd put out a report talking about vulnerable and precarious workers experiencing wage theft. I mean, people that are working that aren't even getting paid, and the bosses, people know that these bosses fold.
They should be thrown in jail.
They fold and they start up again, and they're not prosecuted. There are two sets of laws in this country, and if you are poor, you don't have access to the courts in the same way, and you don't get treated the same way. I don't know what to say to you other than
That to me is power.
We have to that's where we have to start talking to the corporate citizens in our midst, and also the wealthy, as if it matters to them. It might very well matter to their kids in 15 or 20 years. I think the biggest indication that people are starting to get, they're starting to twitch, is that they're seeing that their kids, who have had every benefit in the world, are failing to launch. And they're thinking, oh, maybe this isn't just us. Maybe this is systematic. The middle class is anxious because we're the 11th largest economy on the surface of the planet. And we cannot see going down the road that we can guarantee for our children the same middle class that we grew up in. But the economy's still growing, right? Like, profits are still rising. Why is it we cannot afford to do well by the next generation? So that's why I think maybe you're tapping into one aspect of a story that really gets under people's nerves, including some of the rich, because the rich and the poor, they don't have the monopoly on being an asshole. There's great people and assholes in every income strata.
I've done anal, she's done assholes, so it's kind of...
We're done. Our work here is done.
What's left? Should we,
Let's not think about that.
Well, let me appeal to your, future MBA side. What was the crime that Royal Bank committed? Probably not Gordon Nixon himself, because I suspect he didn't know about it. But that's not important.
You don't want to talk about it because
care
the
about
program,
that. The crime that he committed was he went to a different source for supply. Period. Should we disallow Canadian firms or Canadians, period, from going to different sources for supply?
Should we allow employers to fire Canadians in order to replace them with cheaper labor?
Yeah. That happens all the time in business, right? If somebody's going to, it's a competitive labor market. If I'm hiring people, I'm interested in how much I'm going to have to pay them. Right? Well, they probably don't enough, but I think the general point is, can you outsource, or should you be allowed to outsource? I think you should be allowed to outsource. I don't think you should be allowed to bring people in who are temporary, who are going to be full-time replacements for people that you fire. We have immigration laws. People can come in due course. They should have to go through all the hurdles that everybody else does, and then they compete in the labor market in Canada with everybody else who's in the labor market in Canada, and we have a competitive labor market. So I don't like the use of the temporary foreign workers program for that purpose. I don't think it was actually being used for that purpose in that case, but let's stick with the general. I think the idea was you're going to outsource to India, you've got to have people come in and learn how to do it. The particulars of the RBC operation, they're here for a short term, they go back and they run the show from India, right? I teach international trade. I'm a liberal, small L liberal, and I believe in international economic transactions. And I think we can compete in that type of environment. I think it's good for the country as a whole to compete in that type of environment. It's not going to be easy always on individual people.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your questions. They were very good. I now turn to the concluding remarks, and we'll begin with Armine for 5 minutes.
I forgot that I had to do this. I completely forgot.
I'll take 10 if you want.
Yeah. I don't know about you guys. I'm more convinced than ever that the wealth have got way too much power. Just especially this last round of questions. But I don't think it's because they're bad people. I think we've got a culture that celebrates wealth and fame and rising to the top, and it actually makes you feel good that somebody's doing it and you want to be them. People don't hate the wealthy, they want to be the wealthy. That said, if they knew how crappy so many of the decisions are that is being made, I think we don't often think about what the consequences are of this lust for more. And we have almost not referred at all to how slow economic growth, which is gripping the world that we live in, how that raises the stakes and increases the friction, the clarity with which some are getting more because some are getting less. Whether that's, not that economics is a zero-sum game, but every time the rate of growth slows, it becomes the transference that has been happening in the last 30 years, the redistribution that has been happening, largely from the bottom to the top, though there are some offsetting policies, becomes clearer and clearer. So you do see, companies like Caterpillar in London saying to workers, yeah, we're a profitable company, but if you want your job, you work for half, or we go. And the workers, a unionized group, said, well, that is an offer we will have to refuse. And the employer took the jobs to some place that was starved for jobs, Muncie, Indiana, where the people gladly worked for half the pay. So there is, the more you can create this sense of desperation, the more the competition that you talk about actually erodes, I think, our capitalism. Actually, in the wake of the fall of the wall in 1989, where there was no East-West split, what we had was the end of history and capitalism rules. There might be, Mel Watkins is sitting in the room. He said, isn't it a funny old world that we would have 200 brands of beer and one brand of capitalism? Well, we do have 200 brands of capitalism, many, many brands of capitalism, but the one that is in ascendance right now is a cutthroat form of capitalism that doesn't make me very proud to be a capitalist. I thought the whole point of a global economy where we compete with one another in free trade was to take advantage of the best that everybody brought to the table, to export a first world way of living everywhere instead of importing a third world way of living to far too many people in this country. It doesn't make me very proud that competition lets some people be the overlords and most people be the underdogs. And I hope that through conversations like this, we can think about what it is it would take to make Canada the place that everybody around, in a few years, we're going to be having a labor shortage that's for real, not the one that we've been talking about in the last 2 years or so. People age 65 and older are working more than ever in our economy because they're healthy and they want to work by and large, but they're not going to be working when they're 80. We are going to be facing a major labor shortage, and we will need to be a people magnet because people all around the world will have their choice of coming to wherever. A civilized society costs money. A beautiful place to live costs money. I want capitalism to work. I love capitalism more than I love every other system that I've seen. As Churchill said, it's a terrible system, but it's better than, well, I'm paraphrasing poorly here, but you know the quote. But I don't think we can maintain our grip on our first world status if we continue down the road that we are. I want the wealthy to be part of the solution. I don't want to be too glib over what happens when people like Bill get up at the microphone.
I was trying to remember what Ann Richards, the former governor of Texas, said about George Bush Sr. in 1988, that he'd been born on third base and thought he hit a home run on life or something like that. So I was quoted as saying the rich are rich because they're successful. That was me being sarcastic. But I think that that's now not being sarcastic. I think that that is the crucial question. After Occupy, the discussion became, is our system fair? Is it tilted? Is it everything flows upwards and everything's taken from the bottom, there's nothing left at the bottom? Is the system unfair? And that bothered me a lot. because I think it's a pretty open system. It's a fairly competitive system. It does provide a lot of opportunity. It provides a good deal of social mobility. Maybe it should have more social mobility. So I didn't like the idea that this system, in which I was heavily invested in more than one sense of the word invest, was just carte blanche being attacked. So I think something Armine said really gets at it, this notion of who should be at the top and why they got there. I think that's what we need. We need a sense of fairness about who's at the top and why they got there. I'm writing a book on this, and I'm looking for a title. The working title now is Fair Inequality. But I start off with Steve Jobs. At one point in his life, I shouldn't, with 2 minutes remaining, start telling you the story of a book, but at one point in his life, he had literally $0. He was in India at the age of 23 or 24, and somebody wanted to go home. He gave him his last $100. He's at zero, right? He dies at $8 billion. Now, how do we feel about that? I think most of us feel, well, geez, you know, he got his $8 billion pretty fair and square, and he's provided these terrific products, and he's made people happy, and maybe it's wrong to be happy about a product and get so much enjoyment from it, but it's a thing of beauty, and you know. So I don't think we begrudge Steve Jobs. Sidney Crosby makes $20 million a year. That doesn't bother me. The guy works hard. Did you see what happened to him when the puck hit here in super slow motion and all the teeth came out and the jaw? You could see the compression going through the jaw. It doesn't bother me a tremendous amount that he gets $20 million a year. He's extremely talented at what he does, and millions of people are eager to watch what he does. And I'm appreciative at this hour that you're really eager to watch what he does. Bernie Madoff. Well, he made a lot of money too. We're all agreed that, you know, he's not allowed to make the money that way. We don't need new laws to deal with that. He was put in prison with old laws. I then quote some guy that Vietnamese immigrant in the U.S. won the Super Bowl lottery, won $365 million. A guy from Vietnam, speaks very little English. How do we feel about him? I don't like public lotteries, so I don't feel good about him, but I think most people figure, well, he won the lottery, so he's doing lots of good work with it. He's helping out his extended family in Vietnam and so on. Jamie Dimon, head of J.P. Morgan, right, very rich guy. How do we feel about him? Well, I wouldn't want his job, even at the god-awful amount of money that he's paid, right? He's paid, like, some years he gets $40 million. 2009 he got $1 million, and that was a cut. That would be a lot for me. But I think that's the kind of discussion that we should have. We shouldn't say the system, capitalism, is corrupt or wrong or unfair. I think what we got to do is look at individual things that are going on. There clearly was a lot of concern about people at the top of big financial institutions that seemed to screw up. I don't agree that they still got paid what they had been paid, because they did generally suffer losses. They did, many of them, lose their jobs. Some of them got golden parachutes. Some had golden parachutes saved up. They're in disgrace. I'm not sure that I'd want, you know, they can still play golf every day. That's nice, but they are in disgrace. So I think what has to be looked at is a very micro examination of what goes on in this system that we have, which is generally not, I would argue, unfair, but may have significant patches of unfairness in it. Then the big policy question becomes, can you fix that unfairness in a way that doesn't screw things up even worse? And my argument is that some of the executive compensation that you observe in the 1990s and 2000s was a result of Congress limiting the amount you could pay executives in salary. Because in 1990 it was thought offensive that people could earn $500,000. Corporations figured out, well, we don't give them dollars, we'll give them stock. That gets them up to $100 million, and nothing else does. So I think, you know, there's lots of very interesting questions to argue about, but I think it has to be done at a micro level and with somewhat less indictment of the system in general.
I think we've had a very good pair of presentations, and I now want to ask you to offer a judgment again, a final show of hands. How many of you think that wealth has too much power in Canada? Please raise your hands. How many of you think that wealth does not have too much power? How many of you remain undecided? I can't understand why you can't make up your minds. But there's no doubt that a majority, and I'm not sure it changed, a majority certainly believe that wealth has too much power in Canada. So let me ask you to thank our speakers for a very good job, and I'll call on Brian for some final words.
Well, let me start by asking you to join me in thanking Jack Granatstein for having moderated such a fine debate, and to our two debaters for having done such a great job. All I can say is money doesn't buy happiness, and the proof is that people with $10 million are no happier than people with $5 million. To Bill Watson, I want to say that my view is that Johnny's second most famous quote was, "There's only room for one drunk in this cabinet."